So hi, while we get seated, I'm Caleb Solomon. I'm a senior editor at Bloomberg News. I'm lucky enough to work in our data visualization group, which is where pretty cool things happen. It's a really excited, good panel here. We're going to talk about fake news. I think Clay Shirky's right. It's an unfortunate phrase. So by fake news, we mean stuff that's made up, false, misinformation, disinformation. We're going to try to talk about how it's created, how it spreads, and then what we can do about it. We're also going to try to raise the question of how scared should we all be that this is happening, and then we're going to talk about what we can do about it. And by we, I mean, in my case, we as journalists, we as citizens, we as students, we as technologists, we as people in business. So the panel, let me get this right. Dhruv Ghulati is CEO and co-founder of Factmata, an AI startup developing community-driven algorithms to solve the problem of online information and create a quality media ecosystem. Sara Hudson is a writer and technologist, formerly at the Department of Justice, and currently a public interest technology fellow at New America. Aviv Ovadia is chief technologist at the Center for Social Media Responsibility, recently created by the University of Michigan, where he works on trying to ensure our online information ecosystem has a positive impact on society. And finally, Naaman is a chief technologist at the center, is an associate professor of information science at the Jacobs Technion Cornell Institute at Cornell Tech, where he is the founder of the Connective Media Hub and leads a research group focused on social technologies. So to get us started, there's an old journalism maxim that show, don't tell. So we're going to do a little bit of show for the moment. And the first thing we're going to show, there's no political intent to this. It's just a demo of the technology. So let her rip.
We're entering an era in which our enemies can make it look like anyone is saying anything at any point in time, even if they would never say those things. So, for instance, they could have me say things like, Killmonger was right. Or Ben Carson is in the sunken place. Or, how about this, simply, President Trump is a total and complete dipshit. Now, you see, I would never say these things, at least not in a public address, but someone else would. Someone like Jordan Peele.
And what do we make of it? Panel, how frightened should we be about this? Yeah, Aviv, please, go ahead.
So, I think that, there's a few things to note about that piece. That's using a combination of technologies. One, where someone's face is being used to affect the face of a recording. Another, that it's using voice modification. So someone's voice is being made to say things that weren't actually said by that person. And so both of those technologies can be used in a variety of wonderful ways for entertainment, wonderful ways for like sort of low bandwidth communication in different areas and things like that, and also lots of very terrifying ways for our democracy and for our ability as journalists, for our ability as people, let's say, trying to prevent human rights abuses around the world and trying to see what's really going on and how people are doing horrible things to other people and then saying they didn't actually do it.
So, go ahead.
Yeah, I was just going to say that technology as well is extremely advanced. This earlier versions of that, this was produced maybe about sort of 3 months ago, and it's getting better, every day. And it's available to everyone, really. I think are we going to go through sort of the deep fakes stuff?
Yeah,
I mean,
we are.
This is technology that anyone can right now, go in an open source, piece of code and create that using their own image files, using their own video files. So I think there's a long way to go. But we'll go on to other videos, but I think there's a long way to go to kind of...
Yeah.
So 2 things that I would add to that. One, we are investing more time in further developing technologies that will develop even more augmented realities than we already live in right now, than we are in actually figuring out how to counter them, how to protect folks, and 2, how to ensure that when it is a public official, when it is somebody that you think is an elected representative, or if you are an elected representative, if you are someone who thinks that people are saying something to you that has public policy impacts, that has government impacts, that has impacts on the services that people may or may not get if they think an elected official thinks all of these voters really want one thing or want something else. It is a further example of we don't have to put on Google Glass to live in an augmented reality, because the way that we walk through the world right now is already shaped by not facts, but pieces of facts, by not what we think we are seeing, but what people want us to see. We have now moved to visual, and that's extraordinarily scary.
Could we recognize this in real time? Is this obvious? Did you guys think this was real? No, you could tell it wasn't because the lip sync was a little off, or what? Yeah.
It wasn't his voice.
Okay.
This format leads you to think it's fake.
Okay. Okay.
Could
So
you-
we
right.
stacked the question. Okay.
Could you tell it was real if you were scrolling through Facebook
Yeah.
and you had mute off and you were just scrolling and you had the subtitles? Could you tell if it was real if it was on a billboard in Times Square? Where do we input all of these different audios and videos that we see? How much attention are we paying at any time when we're checking our phone, we're tweeting, we're walking, we're calling a taxi, we're calling a Lyft? How much attention will we actually pay to the small details that you can still see that say, wait a minute, wait a minute. We don't do that right now with the way we read. What makes us think that we'll do that with the way that we watch?
Sure.
Yeah. I think another point I'd say is that, you know, what's clear from sort of a solution standpoint is that that example there has been taken from audio, an audio file, a different video file, splices of different images. And what's clear now, to actually detect that video, we're going to have to rely on our senses a lot more, our sort of capabilities as people to sort of make reasoned judgments. That's going to be much, much more important in the internet today. And you know, sort of the human comes in the fore, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
And to answer your question there, like we can currently detect that both
That one.
see that was not real. We can do that with current technology. Like that bridge has not been crossed. That doesn't mean that bridge can't be crossed, because this is a sort of a cat and mouse game where, as you create technology to detect, technology to avoid detection can get better. And there's even, like if you're talking about, again, like a generative adversarial network, not actually necessarily used for some of the technology here, but you can apply that sort of thing where you have, you know, two basically AIs competing to trick each other. And so that basically means that the easier it is to see if something is real, the faster you can do that, then the faster it is that you can train it to avoid being detected.
Could we find this in real time? Could we spot this as a fake instantly?
I believe that right now we can.
Okay.
I'm not 100% sure.
Okay. So let's take a look. We've got another one. Let's just take a look at another real fast. This is of a different nature. And to give you a sense as we're building up to it, so this is this will be Daisy Ridley, who's been the last two Star Wars movies. And if we're having trouble, we'll do. Oh, there she is. So this is just repeats, and so what this is this is Daisy Ridley's head on somebody else's body, done really cheaply and inexpensively by, I'm not sure who exactly, but the key is I get the sense that I could do this.
Yes, yeah, I'm guessing this is through deepfakes.
Yeah, right, exactly. You want to talk about that a bit?
Yeah, so deepfakes is essentially, there was a guy on Reddit, a person on Reddit basically, you know, producing this open source code that anyone can go on right now and create something like that. And some of the sort of use cases that he was using was sort of not safe for work celebrities on porn videos. And you know, one of the things, you know, in terms of implications I was going to talk about is, you know, we talked about democracy and politics, but think about sort of, you know, the implications for sort of biometric identification. You know, as governments in third world countries are thinking about, you know, making everything automated, how you can basically, you know, circumvent this, you know, escape that detection. And you know, from that perspective as well, reputation management. So you know, we've been thinking about how, you know, any sort of big brand, or you know, you could put the face of a CEO, or some you know, anyone sort of online, and sort of put them on this kind of thing, and then spread it. It's a combination of creating the video but also making it viral which is where sort of the botnets come in. That's what I'm also very, very worried about, the sort of shouting match on the internet.
Yeah, more, please.
To me, the greatest worry for this and the other technologies and things that we see today in everybody's phone, maybe I'll give an example in a second, is the undermining of global trust. So we can no longer trust, or we can definitely not trust our lying eyes. We can barely trust each other. Today with Chinese phones, a lot of Chinese phones ship with a beautification algorithm, right? So you take a photo and it will make you more beautiful. It will make your eyes larger and your skin smoother and a lot of other manipulation. In fact, I think there are a number of buttons you can choose to produce an image that it maybe is your likeness, but is not you, right? So what does it mean? Does it mean that when we send information, even in personal settings to each other, we can no longer trust that people represent themselves correctly? Now, this happens in interpersonal relation. This will happen in online community and news settings, and this will cause people to maybe stop believing and start evaluating, but maybe stop believing anything altogether.
And
If I can just
Yeah, please,
add
go
on
ahead.
to that, the thing that worries me the most about this is twofold. One is public safety, and the second is specifically around women. I started my career in the Office of Homeland Security in New Orleans, and one of the things that we always looked for translation of emotion into action, and we see that across the world. And the capacity to be able to take people's bodies and manipulate them, both in what they are doing and what they are saying, is a direct cause of violence against women that has come from the internet and moved into real time. This is already a huge problem. To see that at scale is an incredible threat to public safety.
And I think that's a key piece. I mean, we could always touch up photos. Somebody could always, manipulate video, movies forever, but the fact that it's in pretty much anybody's hands right now, the cost of doing this is kind of zero.
And just to add to that, first on the public safety side, that I'm especially concerned about how this can stir ethnic tensions and just the ways in which this is already being used. So you already have Photoshop being used in this way. You already have just slightly modified videos and audio being used to cause real violence, like cause towns to destroy each other across the developing world, and even in the United States potentially, maybe not with mass arson and lynchings, but we're not there yet. But there are many parts of the world that are. So that's a real and present and current danger. And this, in terms of are we there, in terms of can anyone do this right now, I wouldn't say that. I think that we have, right now, someone with a decent amount of technical skill can use fake app to make something that's somewhat convincing, as we're able to see with that second video. But even that first video actually did have a bunch of sort of post-production work. And so we're not quite at the point where this is going to be able to be used by any of you in your phone tomorrow. But we will be at that point within the next few months to few years, and that will have all of these impacts, and we need to be ready for that. And I don't think that we are right now.
I think I remember where that video is from. I think there's a company called Lyrebird, lyrebird.ai. And they produce, I think they're producing this technology basically for sort of marketing, advertising purposes. And the idea is you can sort of doctor, get an audio sequence. And if you're trying to create a marketing video, you can sort of amplify it or enhance it with another audio sequence to kind of make it a bit more exciting or a bit more. So this is technology that's been produced by startups, by technology companies in research labs and now being brought out in the world.
This is a technology that everybody under 30 in this audience have on their phone right now. If they use Instagram or Snapchat, right? You have the filters that are right now, adding silly bunny ears to your image in real time, but can also in the future maybe make you smile when you talk to another person,
age you.
make you, or age you, or make you look more trustworthy or more beautiful
Or younger.
All of that already exists in many people's phones,
That's right. And that can increasingly happen in real time, in personal conversation.
And as a journalist, the phrase you mentioned, Avi, was slight modification, and more, we've talked about this as well. This slight modification seems to be a real danger zone. We can sort of, we hope, at least question obvious fakes, but then the tweaks are where it seems to be a real gray zone, real danger zone. I guess, Sarah.
One parallel I think about is, we all do this. How many people now have like carpal tunnel or problems with their thumbs that Steve Jobs would have never thought a byproduct of creating the iPhone back in the day is that folks we would be using muscles that, evolution-wise, we were not intended to use. That's the kind of long-term thinking we have to have. So when we're developing these capacities, we're thinking both about what is the ways that these can make our lives better, but how can they be used against people, and not just the people who might be buying them, but the folks who are often displaced, who are women, people of color, children, the elderly. How do we think ahead 10 steps instead of a think ahead 2 steps?
I'm reading *Sapiens*, and it just reminds me of sort of how historically we haven't ever thought about these things. Mankind has never thought about how technology can, be used for bad. We've always been, if you think about, and the example that he uses is sort of, the technology improvements in agriculture, I remember, and sort of how that's kind of led to this sort of revolution where we're actually working much harder and, we're not actually living. So I think this is an example of that as well, how technology is are our lives enhanced because of this?
We're absolutely very good at imagining how technology can help and always fail to figure out how it can fail us.
Right, and to even think about what we need to do ahead of time as we're developing new technology to mitigate some of those negative aspects. And I think that's something that we really need to be conscious of, just as technological entities in the world. We need to be paying close attention to as we create things. What are those consequences? How do we ensure that we can devote resources to addressing those unintended consequences, addressing those externalities, in the same way that when you build a factory, you're also polluting that stream. Well, how do you address that? Well, can we do that in other domains?
That's an interesting question because it also brings back, whose responsibility is it? Is it the schools that have the teachers that are teaching the kids to say for every X hours of classes, you have X hours of ethics training along with it, at the ethics of technology? Is it the investors who are putting money into the schools or into the technologies? Is it Silicon Valley itself? Is it policymakers and folks in government on the regulation side? Who actually owns the responsibility is also
I think
great.
the challenge is even greater because even if we somehow as a society do this all correctly, we'll still have the bad actors that can put together this technology and distribute it in a way that we cannot control.
Right.
From a technology solution standpoint, the literature that I've read on this sort of fake videos stuff is that the feature space of different manipulations you can make on a video per the region of the video, per keyframe, per pixel, is so vast that it's impossible to get a supervised training set, which is actually a massive, massive problem. So what I was reading was actually this is the best we can do is actually think about this as anomaly detection. So it's more about, is this video something that's less credible than something else relative to something else? You cannot do a sort of direct classification. The largest data set that's been produced was about 1,004 videos and about 500,000 frames. It's not that large if you think about sort of how big deep learning data sets need to be, in the order of billions.
Right.
So I'm quite worried about actually where, and by the way, that paper was produced in March. So we're actually very, very behind, I think, in terms of thinking about data sets, and I think I'll talk a bit later about how that can be improved.
That's good. So in fact, we at Bloomberg have a very large and highly skilled group of social velocity teams who are looking to spot news and then to verify news. And mostly you can say that's not real, but ultimately being able to say that something is real is at times a leap, and is in some ways the hardest thing that we try to do. We know fakes, but then finding verified, no doubt, is a lot harder.
So I'm not worried about the media. I think the media will be able to use all these insights and heuristics and perhaps some training and perhaps some automated systems to help detect fake, less or more obvious. But turns out, over the last 10 years, that media is not our gateway anymore for information.
I've heard that.
Sorry. And people will get this information elsewhere.
Right.
And the need to identify and find it and highlight or demote it in other platforms, in other settings will be critical, I think, for this effort.
I wanted to raise another example as where this stuff is really, really hard. It's in the same space as things like digital forensics. And I would, if you're interested in this topic, I would look at two things. I'd look at the work of Bellingcat, which is basically sort of a charity looking at kind of detecting doctored videos, and also the work of the Digital Forensics Lab. And one example that's actually come out recently is an example used in elections was there was a Moldovan TV channel that basically had taken a video from Al Jazeera and superimposed that, and sort of the transcript, this Digital Forensics Lab was sort of seeing that the transcript that they used was completely different. Like when they actually translated it, it was made up, and it was trying to show that the mayor of this, the Moldovan mayor was actually campaigning to auction out I think their main town to Abu Dhabi for 50 years. Whereas actually the segment that was taken from Al Jazeera was talking about UAE-Yemen relations.
Right.
So, but it required someone to go into the video, look at the transcript, look at the actual sort of source and target sort of splices within the video.
Right.
It's very, very difficult work, and they write these huge blog posts about it. And so I think, again, if you're scrolling through your Facebook feed and you have, a second, are you going to actually be able to do that?
So let's look at one more video. And Aviv, can you describe this? This is one we're going to do without sound, and just sort of describe once it gets going what it is we're seeing.
Feel free to chime in.
Yeah.
Right. So, and this is sort of
Any commodity.
in more detail. It shows sort of the initial technology that's used in that Obama video, where this, here you've got some real-time footage that's being manipulated to match the face and lip movements of someone else, right? And so he's moving his lips and mouth and face, or not his face, sorry, lips and mouth and eyes, and that's being transmitted. And what that means is that you can make it look like someone is broadcasting, or that someone who's literally on TV talking about something completely different, have their lip movements, have their face align with that. And I feel like I can't really talk over this because this is just a little bit too ridiculous. And I think this work is really interesting. I do want to highlight that this lab is also the one that created that data set, which is to help actually evaluate if things are fake, right? So you have, and I think that's a great example of someone who's, let's say, moving the research along in one direction. That video was from 2016 that we just watched. So this is 2 years old.
Yeah.
But they're now also looking at ways in which they can help detection strategies. I think that's an important model that we really need to have, where those things really should come together. Let's say you're creating something new that can be abused in some way. How do you ensure that comes together? And as we're thinking about mitigations, one of the things that's really important is structurally, whether you're a researcher or you're a technology company, we need the things that you put out that can be abused to come with the ways in which you can mitigate that abuse or prevent as much of that abuse as possible. And we need systems in place, either within the companies, where, there's, instead of just having the security person sign off, this is safe, this can't be hacked, there needs to be sort of this integrity sign off, this other position, this other org within that group, which is, this is signed off. If this could be abused, we have ways to handle that. And I don't think that we have that in organizations like a Facebook right now. At least Facebook is sort of moving in that direction, but more broadly. And I don't also think that within research labs we have that. And in those cases, you're actually going to probably need some third-party organization with external funding to be like a place where a researcher can go, hey, I'm doing this work. Who's someone who has deep expertise in the social, political, whatever ramifications of my work, and can sort of sketch out how this could be abused, that I can put that both in my paper to sort of here are the good sides and here are the bad sides, and also maybe direct funders to put money into those areas too.
So,
we don't have that infrastructure right now.
I was just going to say, the amazing thing is that this uses autoencoders, but there's sort of a technology called GANs, which is Generative Adversarial Networks, and it's amazing that that actual algorithm is almost like the analogy is of someone creating a fake thing. So the algorithm works where you have sort of like a counterfeiter, and then you have a discriminator, and someone generates, it generates a fake distribution, and then the discriminator is trying to say, is this fake or is this not? And then they work together, and the end result is that you can't tell things alike. That's literally how the algorithm works. And so now it's being used to create fake videos.
So that takes me to another sort of a cosmic question, stepping back from that. So, which is basically kind of how scared should we be at this moment? And so our editor-in-chief, Bloomberg's editor-in-chief, John Micklethwaite, this morning actually talked about with a little bit of optimism. I mean, I took notes. He's my boss. He opened the conference with saying the technology, yes, this is making this more difficult right at this moment, but historically we've been through this before. We've gone through eras before. We, the collective we, have come out of it, and we've been in a better place, and news will become better and easier, he said. So is he right? How scared should we be? Anybody?
Well,
go ahead, more, please.
Here's the good news and the bad news. The good news is I think we're in a place that's slightly better than we were 2 years ago.
Okay.
I think at least some of the problems that we've seen 2 years ago, and it relates to some of your points of view, are now at least somewhat countered by the platforms, some of the news organizations, and others. So if you're looking at Facebook and Twitter, I think they're paying more attention to some of the issues from 2 years ago. Whether or not they're prepared to tackle the new kinds of misinformation, disinformation, fake news phenomena, that's a different question. And how quickly we can reach balance again in this ecosystem, that's another question. So I think I may share the optimism that we can do it. I don't know if we can do it fast. It can be years before we reach the equilibrium again.
Okay.
So I'm extremely pessimistic. And there's a few reasons. I think these platforms in the world that we live in today, that technology is highly incentivized. I talked about the example of marketing and sort of advertising. I believe the last statistics on Facebook were that 98% of their revenue comes from advertising. I mean, you're sitting in New York. This is the world of media and advertising. This technology is incentivized. And if we don't think about a way where something that is well produced is not just about thinking about virality or engagement and clicks and impressions, if we cannot incentivize content that isn't just thinking about that, there's no way that this is going to be solved. We need to think about a better incentive model, I think, on the internet for this content.
Completely agreed. The problem of disinformation is the problem of information in a digital age. What does it look like? The internet, the World Wide Web turns 29 years old this year. So we're getting into middle life. What does it look like to have a midlife crisis? That's the question we need to be asking. What does it look like to have a way to build, what does it look like to have a world where when we cross over this year and we have over 50% of people online, where we are building communities that are not actually let's segment you and make you find people that you like and see only little bits of things that make you feel certain ways so that you stay in one place. We have the world's best engineers and data scientists working every day to make us addicted to stay and to read and to feel and to segment and to not actually to think. What does it look like to counter that? And I will also just put on my government hat for a minute and say that there's millions and millions of amazing people working across government, but it's not coming to save us, y'all. Like, we're still trying to get off of paper. So, like, what does response at scale look like, and who's going to fund it?
I just want to bring back the Sapiens argument, because the thing, it's such a good book, but like one of the things that it talks about was sort of like there were these hunter-gatherers sort of picking berries and picking fruit and sort of herbs and stuff, and then you had the agriculturalists. And in this whole debate, there's always this sort of backward people who are thinking about all these kind of solutions and seen as the kind of scaremongers. But then there's also the force of kind of change and how, well, think about the potentials for marketing, think about the potentials for branding. Like, that voice is extremely strong, right? So and I think there is a big role for government to think about, is that direction and we've definitely faced these things, like I said, hunter-gatherer time. So is the voice of people who think about sort of the quality of news or thinking about the quality of media, is that going to win over the sort of power of kind of brands and yeah.
So, speaking of, you're talking about earlier times, so let me take you back actually to the beginning of the web and maybe even before hunter-gatherer times to really the development of species. Hang on. Yeah.
Okay.
1 second, I'll explain. And I think it has to do with incentives and in particular risks in our media ecosystem. This is some ideas that we've been thinking about borrowed from signaling theory that has been used in biology, right? So there's deception in the animal world. Is interesting. There's an equilibrium of deception that can happen. For example, if you look at the colorful poisonous fish, so the flamboyant cuttlefish, radiant fish that tells you with its color that it's poisonous. And the reason it can do it with the colors is, well, it's taking a risk, right? Because it's easier, the sharks have an easier time to find it. And if it wasn't poisonous, the sharks will learn to find it and eat it. So it is poisonous. There could be some deception. There could be some fish that are colorful, but they're not poisonous. They kind of hide in the shadow of the cuttlefish. But if there are too many of them, then the sharks will learn how to eat them. So that risk is a foundational element that creates equilibrium in biology. It doesn't exist online. It used to exist online. There used to be a cost associated with publishing content online that the cost may be a risk of spending money that told you that somebody is reliable. So think about the 90s, early web. Having a well-designed website with a decent URL meant that you're a credible organization, right?
Sure.
GeoCities, no. NewYorkTimes.com, yes. Today, we have the Denver Chronicle because it's so easy to produce content. There's so little risk. In fact, there is reward in producing fake content and no risk involved in producing that fake content. And that's equilibrium that needs to change.
Go ahead, Aviv, please.
Oh, I think we need to create a market for reality, and I think that right now the market does not reward reality, and that's sort of the core of this problem, and I think that that's sort of the core of the solution. And there's a lot of components to putting that in place that require everyone sort of across the board, and every part of our ecosystem needs to be a part of creating that market.
That's actually a great point. So if you think back, since we're going back into the web, like how many people here at one point in their life got on Napster, for example? Okay. How many people have done that in the last 2 months? How many people used to see pop-up ads, all of the time in the beginning of the web? How often do you see them now? There are things that we said this has a cost, whether it was we consumers or say we Hollywood who said Facebook has figured out a way to not have actual full videos come straight from movie onto Facebook. Like there's monopolies of different kinds that have figured out how do we incentivize the internet to make a change. The question and the problem right now is exactly this. We don't feel the cost. We don't feel the cost that our kid is playing on Facebook and Facebook has our kids' data. We don't feel the cost of just using the internet the way that it is meant to be used because it feels good and it's a place where things become easier rather than harder. And we're going to have to make it harder and then say that that's actually a reward.
So Sarah, optimist or pessimist? You went both ways on that one.
Do I see a world in which consumers want to use the internet in a way where pop-up ads come back? We haven't figured out how to make reality real for folks, to make this reality, the reality that we have been talking about in this room all day, real to the millions of people who are on the internet right now. And we understand reality in that we exist in physical places, but we don't understand that we don't exist in reality. We exist in an augmented reality every time our head moves to the cloud. That is an incredibly difficult education. But in the last, 29 years, we've also created the World Wide Web and adopted it. So,
yep.
So I think it's I want to bring up the example, you talked about pop-up ads. So pop-up ads was basically, we all know AdBlocker and AdBlock Plus. It's a very, very small German company, and it only makes, I think, around, in their last reports, it makes about $4 million a year. So it's not a very, very big company. But the effect that they've had in terms of actually going against the tide of big platforms and saying, look, if you want to block ads, you can use this tiny little Chrome extension. And everyone got on it. And what that led to was, the big platforms, they had to then, if you wanted to get your sort of ads unblocked, you had to follow AdBlock Plus's guidelines. They created the guidelines for good adverts. And then they got released, and suddenly we have kind of relatively okay adverts. So I think it takes this kind of like revolutionary companies and sort of people who, and support for those kind of disruptors.
Well, that's exactly the kind of risk I was talking about. But the problem is, yes, you have maybe the fringe actors here that can act on it easily. But Facebook and Google, if they now pull ads from half of their online publishers, they're not going to look good for Wall Street. So there are a lot of pressures from those companies that can actually enact the change around the web.
Yeah, so we've covered a lot of ground. I think it'd be a good time to start getting any audience questions, if you've got any. Ooh. Two it is. Well, I saw that hand first.
Thank you for the discussion. So my name is Naaman Parek, and I manage an AI fund called Cassius Capital. My question to you is, I like the concept of products and product success models being Darwinian. And it's great because you have to evolve and you have to see how the products come through. But when a network or platform gets too powerful, there's always going to be people that try to exploit it. Regardless, Cambridge Analytica is just one of many different phenomena that has occurred in the past 20, 25 years when the world got more interconnected. And the long-term solution is getting people to change their mental models, hopefully not too long, but to wrangle the political stakeholders, the behemoths, the giants of corporations. So my question to you is, in the short term, as technologists, product leaders, and product designers and product managers, do you include these societal risk elements, in your technical debt cycle or your sprint cycles, or something where you can actually counter that actively versus retroactively?
Yeah, I mean,
Emphatic, yes.
exactly yes. I mean, I'm not sure. Like, there's going to be different layers where you actually put that into organizational processes, depending on the size of your organization, the way everything else fits within that. But yes, you need that to be part of the process of the organization, or it will not happen, and you will go up before Congress and apologize, and then you'll do it again, and then you'll do it again.
Or you just won't show up at all.
Or you'll just die.
I run a startup that's kind of trying to solve this problem, and one of the things that we, in our values, is actually about explainability of our algorithms. The bias of our algorithms are evaluated all the time. We constantly think about, if we're building training data, where it's coming from, what's the ethics of the training data that we're getting. GDPR is coming out in Europe. We are thinking about that now. Startups do not have the sort of resource to think about it, but we see the importance of it. I think another thing that we've been thinking about is sort of this kind of 10, 11-year horizon of, okay, well, if this works, if what we do works, and we sort of have this market for quality, what is that? What are the societal implications? And I think what it will lead to is that there are people who are defining that quality, right? So we need to think about, who is it that says that that's a good thing or a bad thing, or that's a good video or a bad video? What are their biases? Can we sit in this room and sort of say that's a bad thing, or, because maybe it's just funny. Maybe it's just kind of, we need to think about the sort of long-term implications of kind of who are the people who are defining these things. Sure. And we need to take a stand. There will be biases.
Okay. One more question, I'm told. Please.
Yeah. To what degree is the world of Silicon Valley and the technology industry actually standing up and recognizing the problem and maybe doing something about it? I mean, venture capitalists act as mentors to young entrepreneurs and older entrepreneurs. To what degree do they want, are they guiding them to take some responsibility, be ethical? Are we seeing that at all, or it's just the media people who are talking about this?
Sara, you're an investor. What's your take on this?
Sure. So, and Aviv and I were talking about this a little bit earlier. kinds of questions that we're asking in this room right now are the same questions that folks are asking in Silicon Valley, and they don't have the information. So yes, people are stepping up, and investors don't know what to do. They hear the bots are coming, and they hear disinformation. And so there's the investment side, which is how do we actually put money into helping humanity evolve at scale in ways that actually is supporting and not suppressing. But then the second one is, how do we, who in addition to being investors in maybe our personal lives, who also own enormous companies that may or may not be part of the problem, how do we infiltrate that back, down through? And so there's kind of two separate chains that get addressed there. And they're both being worked on, and they're being worked on slowly. And it is what it feels like, but it's also because folks are trying to struggle even to define the problem. We joked about the number of mapping exercises that goes on. And I will say, as somebody both who has built things and helped invest in people who are building things, the amount of players in the field right now, and Kelly, who's going to be on later, and a whole bunch of folks in the room can speak to this, this was like no man's land 18 months ago, 2 years ago, any time before that. Now it's crowded rooms full of people with questions like, what do we do, and how do we do it, and where do we do it, and what do we do first? So we're at least moving forward.
More, you have a thought?
Yeah, from the academic side, I can say, I remember going back to when I got my PhD to now, I think there's a huge difference in how computer science and other related departments think about the ethics and teach that to their students. So I think that's good news. We have in New York, in fact, you'll see later today, some demos from a course that we did that was called Tech, Media, and Democracy, where we brought students together in the same room, which was even more effective. We had the computer science students, and we had journalists, and we had media studies, we had creative writers. I was co-teaching with 2 poets, which is something I don't know if I'll get to do ever again. And they were not only trying to understand what tech's role in addressing the situation, but also to understand how the proposed solution may interact with other considerations, other viewpoints, and especially the media studies people, and the journalists asking the right question, the media studies people providing the right critique was really instrumental for my students, the computer science students, to understand the full consideration. So I think more and more of this is happening in academia. The people who end up in those companies are more and increasingly informed.
That's great. So I think we should end on that note of somewhat optimism, which is good. So thanks, everybody. Thank you.